Hello and welcome to the Hard Questions. I'm Solomon Serwanja. On this episode, I speak with the country director of ActionAid International Uganda, Xavier Ejoyi. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the show.
Thank you, Solomon.
Great. Javi, the latest story of the Iron Sheet scandal continues to dominate the headlines today. In fact, I'm holding to newspapers. That's the Daily Monitor that today speaks to Museveni nails 20 ministers on iron sheets, as well as the New Vision that is speaking to iron sheets, Museveni to take action on ministers. It continues to be one but many of the stories on corruption in this country. And it's a face to the statistics that Transparency International has been putting in our faces. The last time I checked, we had the position of 127 out of 178. The Global Integrity Report also paints us in a very bad light in terms of corruption. Let's start there. And I know that ActionAid, one of its cores is to, be the voice of reason and of civil society to push back on corruption. What do you make of this Iron Sheet scandal? Let's start there.
The Iron Sheet scandal is just a manifestation of the decay in our public service that has become nicely sugar-coated as corruption. It is serious theft that is epitomized by senior public officials who have finally been caught with their hands in the cookie jar. That is what has become of the Iron Sheet scandal. But as you can see, the news headlines, they put really the responsibility where it is. And we're starting to hear from the president of the country and being his servants. I think that it is important that he spoke on that matter relating to what to do, what actions to take going forward. Because as we talk about iron sheets that are meant for Karamoja, it epitomizes one, diversion of public goods, in this case meant for people who are really at the dire end of this country's economic development, to private individuals, some of them on their farms, some of them as donations to relatives, and some for projects that are for their constituents, which is really a private political mileage that they're seeking. And so the essence of taking public property and diverting it for private benefit is what this Iron Sheet scandal here is manifesting. The only difference here is that we've had at once quite a number of ministers, over a dozen ministers implicated in this whole saga.
Some of whom are saying that they got the iron sheets and took them to their constituencies, gave them to churches, gave them to schools, donated them to their different communities and constituencies. By the way, not only ministers, including some MPs.
Sure, and that is the precise definition of corruption. It is taking what was intended for Karamoja to your constituency, which is elsewhere from Karamoja. And that is the succinct definition of corruption, that no one needs to look any further. If these iron sheets were taken to a school in Karamoja, a church in Karamoja, which was intended, and then it would have perhaps been still not something that needs to be condoned, but at least somebody would say that this is closer to home. But no, it is taking iron sheets meant for young people who were cattle rustlers and somehow have abandoned cattle rustling, and they're looking for other livelihoods. They're looking at women in Karamoja who are engaging in other livelihoods, who need a roof over their heads, and are given iron sheets. And those iron sheets, and I must add, goats, have been diverted elsewhere or have not arrived at the destination they were intended to. That is corruption. And so there should be no excuse around that. we took it for other charitable causes. No, there's no charitable cause. In public finance, when something is intended for X, it must go for X. It should not go for Y. However charitable it might appear. And what I'm saying is that it is actually criminal. It is corruption, it is immoral, and it is not acceptable that people who we charge with the highest level of decision making in this country should be deviating from what the public expects from them.
It is precisely about 39 billion shillings the president actually, promised these people. They requisitioned from this money from Parliament. Parliament passed the budget, 39 billion. These iron sheets have not all gone to Karamoja. And at the center of this is the Prime Minister's office, is the Minister of Karamoja Affairs, who perhaps would know better. Because when you hear many of these ministers, some of them say, like Matia Kasaija, well, I found these iron sheets in my compound, and I'm able to give them back to you. The Speaker of Parliament had to actually take these iron sheets back. There are some ministers who have said we cannot give back these iron sheets. There are different ministers who have said, well, we gave them out. You'd expect that. First of all, what does that mean for leadership? I mean, we're speaking to cabinet here, top cabinet ministers being quizzed to be involved in stealing from the vulnerable, I should add.
It is the highest level of self-inflicted, I must add, vote of no confidence. And they must resign. That's the minimum that they can offer this country. First, you asked about the Prime Minister's office. I think that I've said this on record, that the Prime Minister's office is too convoluted to really coordinate government business as it is meant to do. You have over 8 ministries under that Prime Minister's office. How do you expect, for example, the government chief whip, the one that is supposed to be whipping the government team to perform according to the expectations of citizens, but of the Constitution, sitting under the office of the Prime Minister? How does he, in this case, whip the Prime Minister? How? How can the Prime Minister have 3 deputies and then you have a whole cabinet minister there, ministers actually? How are they supposed to be coordinated? I think that office of the Prime Minister, which has seen scandal after scandal, it's almost like every other year you were seeing scandals coming out of the office of the Prime Minister. I think that it is time to disband that office of the Prime Minister. It is not fit for purpose. And as a result, this country continues to lose a lot of money in that office. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. But it is important that not just the Prime Minister's office, structures in this country that duplicate roles permit corruption to go unfettered. And that is one thing. The corruption that we're dealing with in Uganda today is not just petty thieves picking money here and there. It is systemic. It is rooted in structures of government. And that is a big cause to worry. And that needs to be dealt with at the source.
Yeah, clearly, the president has come out. Well, all of us have been waiting for him to speak about this. He's really been slow at responding, but eventually there is a letter dated 3rd April writing to the Prime Minister and telling her that they have to return these iron sheets or pay money worth those iron sheets. We're talking about 22,000 iron sheets at this point. And he has said that if they don't, then after investigations by the police, he will take political action. Are you optimistic that he will do that?
First, I think that 2 things out of that letter from the president that I saw. One of them, which I think is long overdue since this matter came up, is that word political action. You see, corruption manifests in different forms. One of the forms is political, and actually it's rearing its ugly head in Uganda today. Political corruption. And the responsibility for addressing political corruption, as the president states in his letter, rests on his shoulders, so he should take political action. Political action does not require investigation into hair-splitting detail of how iron sheets walked into somebody's compound or not, and things like that. Political action just simply means that somebody took iron sheets that were intended for Karamoja and diverted them to their constituency. That is morally repugnant. It is politically unacceptable. Those individuals ought to, especially when they are appointed into political positions, to be asked to resign at a minimum. That would be political action. So I am glad the president is talking about political action, although we are yet to see that political action, and we are eagerly waiting to see that political action take place. But the second dimension of the president's letter, which is really worrisome, is he uses two words, conscience and unconscious. And that is very worrisome. Because in essence, what that means is that there are people who steal consciously and there are those who steal unconsciously. And that is cause for citizens to worry. If we are having, especially in this case, unconscious politicians, then we have a bigger problem than just fight corruption, and which is also now a political problem that should be in the hands of citizens. How did we get unconscious politicians taking or pretending over resources that are meant for conscious citizens? I think for me that is one big thing that I saw in the president's letter that should worry citizens.
Perhaps what he was trying to say is that there are some that received the iron sheets unknowingly. It looks like it was a sharing bonanza, you know. Parliament has approved 39 billion. We've procured 22,000 iron sheets. But, you know, in Kitutu's space, it's like, oh, I have to give the prime minister. Oh, I have to give the vice president. I have to give these ministers. You know, started to distribute. And, you know, Matia Kasaija says he got 300 iron sheets and said, wow, my children are even calling me a thief of 300 iron sheets. You know, maybe, I don't know unconsciously what the president was trying to insinuate here. But it also speaks to the gravity of the issue. This is a serious concern here. A concern that perhaps would, you know, be the opportunity for civil society to point out this evil and demand accountability from the state and push the state to the limits. Are we seeing that civil society play that role, that watchdog role, that push to hold government accountable? Or is civil society since dead and since sleeping?
No, civil society is not dead, is not asleep. Anyone who thinks that they can indulge freely into this level of sleaze regarding public resources and get away from it is in for a very rude shock. Civil society is overwhelmed by the level of graft, as well as all Ugandans. I mean, we're picking on iron sheets right now, but there are multiple other fraudulent cases going on in different aspects. I mean, just pick, for those who read the Auditor General's report and you see from one government ministry, department and agency to another, even if you don't read those Auditor General's report, pick a newspaper, listen to news. You'll just hear these sleazy stories coming up every other time. And of course, civil society, as the name suggests, is not NGOs. I work for an NGO, but civil society is really Ugandans coming together and demanding that their public officials, whether political, technical, or administrative, are held accountable. And as I said, we need to get this right, because people expect that all corruption cases are sorted out in the courts of law by the office of the DPP, by police, by the IG, and by other official agencies of government. And that is expecting too much. By all means, there is need for prosecution for those who are criminally liable and are suspected of committing a crime in as far as public resources are concerned. So we need to do prosecution. But far from that, in addition to the criminal prosecution that needs to be pursued, and here we are really calling out the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions and Uganda Police really to step up their work. They can't be paid by public, and they are not really even assembling the smallest of evidence. This iron sheet scandal has been here for close to a month, and we're not seeing the people who need to be behind bars or at least interdicted doing so. And you can see other agencies are saying, we're waiting for police, we're waiting for DPP and so on. So they really need to wake up. But the point I'm making is that corruption is also a moral question. A moral question in the sense that somehow this society that we have in Uganda today has reached a level where we glorify the corrupt. Somebody will take, you see, corruption, Solomon, is in my view, it is the highest level of impersonation. Impersonation in the sense that you find a civil servant or a public official, a politician in this matter, holding out or pretending to be a farmer. And how do they pretend? They take iron sheets, they take money, they will buy cattle, and they will begin to show the people who look up to them that they are actually farmers, they are doing well. And they are not. What they have just done is to take iron sheets to roof the cattle stands of their farm. And that is something that should not be glorified. The vehicles that they drive on our roads, on our potholed roads, they are really not what they are worth. They are not. And so, that level of glorification of public officials needs also to be addressed. And for us as civil society, we need to really expose these corrupt officials for what they are and not give them safe seats in front pews of churches, in funerals, in weddings. We should call them out. We should not fall for the crumbs of money that they will be contributing for charitable causes and so on. Those are the things that also give an environment for corruption to thrive. And so when we work with citizens, mobilizing them to understand their role in the fight against corruption, it is not going to be like the way the office of the DPP does.
See, I feel you, but what we used to see then, we used to see as civil society, well, you have redefined what civil society is to include citizens, the media, and all that. But NGOs that are into this space, they would coalesce together, come together, you know, mobilize citizens to demonstrate against such things like corruption. We all remember Black Monday, which I think was a very successful campaign because it pushed government to the limits. A proactive civil society that used to push government to be held accountable so much. A civil society that used to put, you know, posters everywhere, return our money, that aggressiveness that would hold the state accountable. I don't see that anymore. What happened to it?
Yeah, but you see, approaches change. We don't, if you're using the same approach 12, 15 years on, when the thieves are also changing approaches, and then you will be ineffective. Civil society, I must say, that has multiple, hundreds of methods of fighting corruption. That's why I'm saying anyone who thinks that civil society is dead, gone, and by the way, for just also to put it out there, government has been targeting civil society. Fighting corruption is a very risky venture that civil society stands up to, NGOs stand up to, and especially for NGOs who use funding from donations to do this kind of work. Government has been really hard on civil society relating to that. We all know they thought that when they suspend a key source of funding for the work of NGOs in this country, that NGOs would be dead. As I said, they will be in for a very rude shock if they think that they can continue with the sleaze and expect that they will get no pushback. The pushback will come from NGOs, will come from other civil society, will come from media, will come from citizens. It will come. There is no way you can take what belongs to the public that citizens pay taxes for, and you are putting it in private business, in your family business, and you expect to get away from it. It is just that the methods of work have and by necessity must change so that we can be more effective in addressing this. As I said, if you look at how we respond to that, it is not necessarily that we are moving on the streets here. It's not necessarily that we are only limited to going to courts of law. That is part of it. But it also means that citizens of a public official, citizens who are constituencies of a political officer who is indulged in corruption, stand up and challenge their leader, or who is supposed to be their leader, but clearly is not leading them. That is also part of the response that we support. We support citizens rising up and taking their leaders on and challenging them without necessarily the name tags of an organization, the brands of an organization. That is when the real essence of fighting corruption, the rubber hits the road.
Well, I hear you, but also, see, what history has showed me in this country is that you've got to push to the limits. And we've seen where such campaigns have been successful. In big democracies or big countries, you now see, I mean, the other day in Israel, Netanyahu was trying to change the justice system to say that parliament, is bigger than the judiciary and it can overturn the ruling of the Supreme Court. As little as that, people went on the streets and decided to, push Netanyahu to the limits, to actually rethink his views. In France, just raising the retirement limit from 63 to 64 years, people went on the streets. In Brazil, there are some things that the citizenry really need to go out, all out, and push the states to their limits so that they can be able to do something. This is what I would have expected in such a scenario.
And Solomon, it is not far from Uganda. The biggest obstacle in the fight against corruption is complacency. Complacency of citizens. Citizens today in Uganda, you hear them say, this is Uganda. When you hear Ugandans say this is Uganda, what they mean is that we are so used to this lifestyle that nothing is going to change about it. We have resigned to fate. That is the biggest challenge in the fight against corruption. And so that is where we want to turn the lever. To turn the lever on citizens realizing that corruption is stealing the future of young people. It is mortgaging the future of young people. It is imprisoning citizens into a health care that is not performing, into an education system that is bare of outcomes. That is what corruption does. And the more citizens are awake to the reality that the potholes they see on the roads that they walk, drive, or ride on is related to a public official diverting funds for their personal gain, the more they see that the mothers and young people dying in health centers, the more they see ghost workers on payrolls, the more they will realize that their stake in the fight against corruption is actually personal. It is not just in official dome. It's not in NGOs. It's not going to come, their redemption is not going to come from government offices. It is in the hands of citizens. But what level of citizen knowledge and awareness is needed to be at a level where they're going to say, we are taking none of this. We're not taking any nice explanations around this graft. We are affected individually, and we are going to put our lives on the line in the fight against graft. That is what it will take to change this nation. And I can say that Ugandans are reaching that boiling point.
But that will take the civil society to do the mobilization and to organize them better. Let's talk about what you had earlier on mentioned, how it's very delicate and hard to push back on corruption. I know that several civil society organizations have been closed, over 54 at that time. I know that your offices have been raided at ActionAid here. I know that there are several incidents where computers are stolen and all that. And that in a way has affected the very work of so many civil society organizations to a point that they are rethinking. And they're thinking about, the thin line between existence and activism, or what they have to do. So they begin to second guess themselves. They begin to think, oh, if we do this, what are the consequences? And therefore they're not all out. They rethink about what they are doing. And that affects the role of civil society in holding government accountable.
No, Solomon, I don't agree with you. I think that we are having an existential threat of our times, an existential threat of public administration and of governance, and of our public officials, some who actually are supposed to be at the forefront in the fight against corruption, becoming very complacent. And this existential threat that we have as a country means that we either fight this graft or we allow them to live large and we cease to exist as a country, as citizens, as a people. And this is really a call for every civic-minded individual organization out there. We do not have a second chance to make a first-time impression. We don't. This is the challenge of our time. And no threat, no closure of organizations, no diversions will substitute this responsibility that we have. Let me tell you this, even if they closed all NGOs in Uganda, in fact, we would look at that first as a badge of honor, that we was really scratching where it is itching. And secondly, that there will emerge alternatives to NGOs, perhaps more vicious in the fight against corruption than NGOs have been able to package nicely in their publications, in their language, and so on. And so, as I said, it is very risky for the corrupt to conspire and think that they can use public officials, they can use security, they can use systems to suppress legitimate efforts of citizens in the fight against corruption. They are in for a rude shock. The kind of formations that can come in this fight against corruption will be unpredictable and will not be easy for them to handle. I think that it is digging their own grave if that's what they thought they are leading into. I think that in the world today, NGOs have a role. In the world today, citizens have a role. NGOs help give awareness, provide information to citizens, and really enable citizens to rise up by themselves. It's not NGOs that should be prompting citizens to rise up. We want individual citizens to say that I drove my car this morning and I went through a pothole and I got a puncture. And who is in charge of these city roads? Is it UNRWA? Is it KCC? And how come that we're having so many potholes and filled with maram each other day? That is the role of a citizen. A citizen has two important roles. Number one is to pay taxes. Number two is to demand for accountability and services, for that matter, from elected officials who are supposed to appropriate the taxes that they pay. And so if citizens are able to pay their taxes and perform one role and not do the other, they are simply renegating on their civic responsibility.
Wow. As we wind up, again, let's go back to the Iron Sheet scandal. The president has deployed the State House Anti-Corruption Unit, the Uganda Police, the Presidential Affairs Committee of Parliament, the Auditor General, the IGG, all of them to look into this matter. It talks about how diverse, we have all these structures and systems that have been put in place to push back on corruption. Have they delivered in your thoughts, in your opinion? Or do we need to rethink our strategy in terms of systems to push back on corruption?
As I said earlier on, first it is risky to fully put all our eggs in one basket in officialdom. As an NGO worker, as civil society, we want to move that narrative away from thinking that official government agencies will in themselves alone fight corruption. They will not. And especially because of the point that you've raised. Our anti-corruption agencies in this country have now duplication of roles. Some are really enshrined in the Constitution and established by law, and therefore deserve support, especially funding, to ensure that they are more effective and efficient in delivering the fight against corruption. But some of them are not enshrined in law, and yet they go around duplicating the roles of established anti-corruption agencies. And therefore, that is a problem in itself. It means that it can be used by the corrupt who are really established in a web or a systemic structure, that they can get away with it. They will say the office of the IG is questioning, the parliament is doing the same, the police is still deciding what charges, even though we know that in some cases they do preemptive arrests and things like that. Why not in this case here? The DPP is still deciding whether to level which charges. So you can see the level of confusion this is causing. And again, the Iron Sheet scandal really demonstrates, number one, the depth and the breadth of corruption that we have. But number two, how this myriad of anti-corruption agencies go around knocking their heads and in the process compromising the fight against corruption in this country. And I do not think that we need to have the number of anti-corruption agencies to deliver as we do today. I think we need to streamline their roles. We need specific mandates in the fight against corruption. We don't need to see Parliament swinging in action because the IG is mentioning something. And I think that the IG should also be straightforward in their approach to corruption and more proactive and take lead. And because the IG has powers of a high court judge, and they should be able to take action even before prosecution or investigation, that they should interdict and so on and so forth. They have lots of powers to dispense justice to the citizens of this country, which in my view they are not really adequately doing. These same public officials now we see in the news as being illegitimate beneficiaries of iron sheets. Just recently, I think by the end of last month, declared wealth and assets. Could these iron sheets be among the assets they declared for themselves? When will the Inspectorate of Government publish the declaration of assets and liability of public officials? Because that is the easiest that we can. So that when somebody says they have a farm with a structure there roofed with iron sheets, we can be able to tell that, look, these iron sheets don't actually belong to you. They belong to the people of Karamoja, and you declared them as assets of yourself. That is actually false declaration, and those are the things that we should see the Office of the Inspectorate of Government following up. If they want citizens to rally behind them in the fight against corruption, and they do need citizens, and then I'm calling on the IG to publish the declared wealth and assets of all public officials. Let them do that. And then we will be able to pick it up there.
And we see who has apartments and who has all this. Javi, let me just conclude with this question. What would you want the president to do for his cabinet ministers who are involved in this scandal?
My appeal to the president of Uganda, the fountain of honor, the chief law enforcement officer, the one who appoints the chief justice, the inspector general of police, the one who appoints the inspectorate of government, the auditor general, the minister of finance,
the commander-in-chief.
Mr. President, I agree with you that there is political corruption, and political corruption does not necessarily have to wait for the office of the director of public prosecutions to adduce evidence of a certain threshold, it only requires an acknowledgement from a political officer that indeed they acted inappropriately. Your Excellency, my ask of you is to ask those who acknowledge that they acted inappropriately to use your words, whether consciously or unconsciously. They need to resign. They don't belong to that office. They are honorable no more. They should resign. That is just a polite ask. And in case they are not, and they are not sure whether they acted inappropriately or not, the baseline is simple. They took what was meant for Karamoja and diverted it elsewhere, or claim that they found it on their compounds or whatever that is. That is ground enough to say that since you've not taken the liberty voluntarily to resign, you are therefore sacked as my political appointee, because you are not living to the expectations that Ugandans want of that office, and certainly me as the president expects of you. So my ask is that you should already ask them politically to resign. Doesn't need to get police investigation reports. They have acknowledged that they did wrong, that they diverted. They took charge of these public resources for their private gain. And so they have invited themselves out of the office that they are holding. That is my ask of the president.
Xavier, thank you so much for speaking to us.
You're welcome.
I've been speaking to Xavier Ejoyi, Country Director of ActionAid International Uganda, about his zeal in pushing back on corruption and what civil society has to do and what you as a citizen have to do. I'm Solomon Serwanja, and this is The Hard Questions.